The Archaeology of Death and Memory with Professor Howard Williams. It's Archaeodeath.
I looked at the Portable Antiquity Scheme data for the whole of the Welsh marches, and of course I'm no kind of expert on the Dykes themselves, but I think that the data can tell us quite a bit really. I did this as part of a PhD study under the supervision of the excellent Professor Howard Williams here, so it's all his fault. Yeah, completely. So this is an area that fascinates me. It's a beautiful part of the world. The Welsh marches are fabulous, but they're very enigmatic as well. And in spite of the fact that we've got quite a lot of well-documented kind of evidence of happenings and events in the area, this is just some of them, we know very little about it. And one of the sources of data that's starting to come to the forefront really is the Portable Antiquity Scheme data. And I should just mention that Nancy Edwards' recent publication on the archaeology of Wales has kind of brought together what we do know about the area. But even so, we've got quite a few holes. And I do kind of subscribe at the moment to the idea that Offa's Dyke was built in the late 8th century and Watts Dyke a bit later. But I realised that I could be ripping that up in a few minutes, completely changing this route. So I'm glad I'm speaking now before anybody else changes the ideas. And, even now we're still saying that there's no real evidence in this part of the world. So this is from Martin Carver's 2019 book. And I hope you can see that he's looking at evidence sources for the different parts of the country. And he talks about Southumbria, which doesn't, even include the marches. But there's, he said there's plenty of evidence for early medieval activity in Southumbria. But for Wales, there's nothing. And that's, pretty much people's conception still. And I'm not criticising Carver. I know the evidence is very scarce over this part of the world. It's quite different to sort of, the East Coast. So one of the things I wanted to do was look at what material evidence there is in the landscape. And this kind of came about because Paul Belfoot, when he was at CPAT, when it was CPAT, he wrote a paper about the silo approach that we tend to take. And because our authorities are split up into counties, and obviously we've got two countries involved here as well, we tend not to take a cross-border approach sometimes. There has been some work done in this, but it's something that we need to do a little bit more, and I think that's coming out of some of the new revisions to the framework for early medieval Wales and that kind of thing. So, I hope it's supporting that kind of approach. That was the area I chose to study. Obviously all the counties that abut the Dykes and the modern border, except for the Cotswolds area of Gloucestershire, because I think that's a completely different entity. So that was just my overall study area. Of course, most of the data on the Portable Antiquity Scheme, this comes from these guys. You can't detect on the Dyke itself, but you can detect in most of the hinterland. There's 1.67 million records at the moment on the Portable Antiquity Scheme across England and Wales, because they both operate the same scheme. Scotland's different, obviously. And of those finds, 41,000 are dated to the early medieval period, which is about 2%. It is a period of time still with very scarce evidence across the country. And even in Norfolk, where, if Detector Assess have got a date in Norfolk, they're very happy, they know they're going to come home with all sorts of things. Norfolk's about 5.9% finds in the period. But, most places like Lancashire at 2.3. And the study area is at 2.59. So you'll see that, from these figures here, if you look at the Portable Antiquity Scheme data for the period, there's only 611 objects found in the area. And it's not much, but at 2.59%, it matches the national average, so it's not hopeless data. And the other thing to say, I think, about this really is that Mark Redknapp in 2022 published a paper about some sites he'd identified in South East Wales, and he used numbers as low as 2 finds or 3 finds to identify the sites. And his contention was that any evidence in the area is important, and it's the type of find that we're coming across that's telling us what's happening. So, having set the scene, and I should just say that the other problem in this area, of course, is detectorists tend not to go for highland because it's not generally farmed, and they like nice cultivated land to work on. So we've got quite a lot of land that's over 300 metres high, which is an intercollegiate kind of bar. We've got a lot of triple SIs and national parks in the area. You think of Shropshire Hills, for example. And we've got a few built-up areas, but obviously not that many around here. So there are some constraints on the type of the hunting of objects. So I was kind of thinking about the objects that were found in terms of the different periods, and of course the antiquity scheme itself divides the early medieval period up into early medieval, middle and late. And they also they call it culture, but I suppose we should say style or idea really. They talk about Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian finds on the database, so I've adopted those terms as well. And I should say that I've not questioned any of the entries on the database, apart from really blindingly obvious errors or duplications. I've accepted the FLO's words because that's what they're there for really. So yeah, that's where we are with that. So what does all it mean, really? So if you map, and Howard's going to tell me that green doesn't show up very well on the screens now because he's always pointed out to me and I should know better. But if we map the finds that are recorded on the PS database for the area, we find a pretty even distribution. There's a bit of a blank spot in the centre, which you'll see again and again. There might be, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you kind of analyse it and zoom in on different areas, you will see that some of the finds follow rivers, some of them follow Roman roads, which you expect because they were still in use at that time. And you also get little areas of clusters which might tell us something about what's happening. If you split it down a little bit more, and this is by culture, the PS scheme calls it, I say ideas or styles really. So the dark green colours are what PS called Viking, the dark purple, and the green ones are Anglo-Saxon. I think there's a pretty even mix of the type of finds that are coming up in the area, which is quite interesting in itself, isn't it? And some of these find spots are multiple find spots, which is why there aren't 611 dots on there. And there's perhaps a little bit of dominance of sort of Anglo-Saxon finds in the central area, but generally they're quite well mixed. And this is the type of thing that's being found, and these are quite interesting in themselves because they're quite specific and quite diagnostic. So the item in the middle is known as an Orr's bell, and it was actually brought over and used by a very small group of people later on in the period who originated from Norway. And it seems to have been something that they used specifically to signal their cultural affiliations or their sort of family affiliations. And the fact that this is found over this part of the world in this period kind of says that maybe ideas and people were moving a bit further west than some people traditionally think. Commentators until quite recently have kind of said that the Anglo-Saxons settled in the east and they only very slowly migrated towards the west, but I don't think the evidence shows that holds up with this anymore. And the same for the periods as well. If you look at early finds, and they're the light green dots, and again, I apologise, I don't think you can probably see those very well. But again, there was a lot of finds very early in the period as well. It wasn't somewhere that people or ideas were arriving at later on. So the whole kind of area was being populated, maybe in lesser numbers, but the ideas were moving across a lot earlier than a lot of people think. And again, you have some particular diagnostic finds. So sleeve clasps are a very early object that's affiliated to a particular group of people. And again, they're quite, I don't think common's the word, but they're found quite often on the east side. To find them on the west is saying that these ideas are moving across early, I think. And you have the whole spread, so you have coins from very late in the period as well. That's a coin of Edward the Confessor that was found in the area. So, it's interesting that some of the finds are very far west as well, on the outer limit of the study area. So you have a very early brooch, but a really, really nice bead as well, and there aren't many coloured beads of that style found, so this is quite an exceptional item for this part of the world. And of course, you have early coins as well, that's a shatter. So that's the kind of picture across the whole of the marches, but if we kind of narrow it down a little bit more to the Dykes specifically, did the building of the Dykes affect this flow of idea and material, or what? So the first thing was that some of the data was taken out, so obviously anything that comes from Cheshire East is not really relevant to this. And in the end, I ended up with about 205 items, kind of directly relate to the area around the Dykes. And I then recategorised it, and this is it's a very crude measure, but it's a kind of a line in the sand. I tried to categorise them as before the death of Offa and after the death of Offa. Because we don't exactly know when the dyke was built, we can assume that if it was Offa, it was built during his lifetime. So that was my kind of arbitrary date. And in some ways it doesn't matter that it's not a very definite date, and it could be, it could be different, because the PAS themselves don't date things so tightly. So you have a range anyway, whichever way you look at it. So that's what I did with that. And then this is the map of the finds pre that date and post that date. And I think it's possible to infer from this that we know we don't get many finds to the west, but the number of finds that were found in the west after the dykes were supposedly built doesn't seem to decline. And it might be that they didn't really have a tremendous effect on the flow and transmission of styles and cultures. There's also no cluster that would suggest a passing place. And I know one of the, the big kind of holy grails of these studies are looking for the places where people moved over the dyke. And I know you can't detect on the dyke, but there's nothing that really suggests a pathway towards it or a convergence anywhere. And it, this lack of influence of the dykes, you could infer from this data. It might be that some people think that the dyke was only in operation for a generation or so, and it might be that that's what this is showing as well, that because of the flow didn't stop, it resumed quite quickly afterwards. And again, we have this lack of finds in the middle of the area, and I know that happens in other periods as well. So Andrew Seaman is looking at Iron Age hoards, and he also sees this gap in the middle. So it might be that something quite different is happening in that part as well. The other thing is that in the south, the spread of artefacts from the period is much further into the west, and that kind of accords with Delaney's study that was published in the Offa's Dyke Journal a couple of years ago, where they contend that the management of the area was different in that period. Something much more nuanced is happening in the south. And whatever the barriers were, they were much more porous. And I think that probably, supports that assumption as well. The type of finds that are coming up earlier on are obviously, well, they're not obviously, I think they're surprisingly domestic. I think there's a lot of kind of personal items that are coming up in this period. And that's maybe against assumptions that have been made in the past about a lot of martial activity. Now, set against that is the fact that detectorists don't look for iron, which, it immediately eliminates swords and knives or whatever. Pardon me. And this is one of the lovely finds from the early period, and this is described on the PAS database as being Irish origin. It's probably part of a penannular brooch. It's probably one of the terminals of a penannular brooch. It's a very fine bit of gold working with some gemstone or glass included. And there's another bit of gemstone missing as well, so it's a very fine piece of high status early work. Later on, of course, because by this time stirrups and this kind of thing has been introduced, you start to get more finds associated with transport of horses. You could argue that that's martial, I call them non-domestic. But maybe it tells us that something a little bit different is happening later, and that there's a need for horses as transport to bring people into the area, or maybe even, if the dyke was for taxes, we're getting people bringing tithes and taxes into the area. Perhaps that's what this is saying. And all of this has got a degree of error, I accept that, but, we have to kind of look at the evidence that we've got, and it's not ideal, and there are other factors that need looking at. But it does give us a bit of a broad picture, really. Again, these are some of the later finds. So you've got different ideas here. So this is a Trewhiddle-style strap end, quite an early find from the early Anglo-Saxon period. And then you have stuff that comes in from Ireland, and a very fine book class later on. Pardon me. I've got 100-day cough, I'm afraid. The other interesting thing to note, and we're going to finish really early at this rate, is the number of coins. So in the sort of pre-offer period, we have 8 coins, which is quite a lot to find in the area, because coinage wasn't really such a developed method of commerce at the time. And then later on we have 12. So the early ones are shatters, including some from Northumberland. And again, it's kind of telling us that the Marches area was drawn into the whole commercial structure across the whole country and weren't at all isolated. The later coins are again, quite wide-ranging. You get coins from Northumberland, some from Dublin, which is to be expected on this coast really, because Dublin was a major centre of trade at the time. But you also have coins from abroad as well. So again, we're talking a complete network here, an integration with other parts of the country, and indeed other parts of the trading areas abroad. And to me, it says that this area was part of a thriving economy. It wasn't at all isolated, and it doesn't really seem to change with the Dykes. It's still a very interesting and active area. This is just to kind of make the point about the south again, and it seems to be more porous. And this is an agreement, as I say, with Delaney's work and Hill and Worthington, who said that the relationship between the people with whatever border existed was different in the south. So if the River Wye was acted as a dike in the south, which may be the case and may not, I know Keith has been looking at the extent of the dikes, acted differently. And this is supported also by the presence of so-called English names in this region, which would kind of add to the idea that there was a lot more happening down there. If we think about the area between the dikes, is quite interesting. There are a few finds, and obviously that's partly to do with not being allowed to detect in the area. But the few finds there are between the two dikes are really interesting because they're all high status finds. Quite a lot of them probably originated in Ireland, in Dublin. So this silver and gilded Parto penamial brooch here, and this horse harness, which was very elaborate and very well decorated. So does this suggest, as I know that Howard and Passy Miretta Flores have suggested, that this area was something of a protected space and a meeting place? And does this also mean that the area around the Pillar of Eliseg was a meeting place as well? I think finding a concentration of high status items in that area might say that this was the case, that there was trading or the important people were meeting here. So I think that's quite interesting as well. And again, I know there aren't many examples, but I defer to Mark Redknapp, who used 2 or 3 examples to identify sites. And I think if we overlay some of the other evidence we've got and finds that are in different collections, we might be able to kind of assert a lot more, really. So that's my conclusions, that it seems to be an area of active, thriving interaction with different cultures and different people. It wasn't by any stretch of the imagination isolated. The south operates a little bit differently to the centre and the north of the area. And the dikes, as far as I can see, didn't have an awful lot of influence on blocking or changing this kind of interaction or flow. I'm very sorry about the cough.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.